welcome to our Chapter 6 lecture for our CIS 2131 course, Python Programming. And in this lecture, we're just going to be going over some slides that I made on Chapter 6 of our text. And Chapter 6 focuses on strings. So we have talked a little bit about strings in previous lectures. So some of this information may be review for you. And that's okay. It's good to review things. So I would highly recommend still, reading and watching the lecture, even if you are already aware of some of these things that you can do with strings. But let's just go ahead and jump right in, right? So what is a string? A string is a sequence of characters, right? And also strings are surrounded by quotes. And in Python, if you'll remember, we can use double quotes like in this top example here, or we can also use single quotes. In other languages, you can only use double quotes for strings and single quotes are for characters. In Python, you're able to use either double quotes or single quotes. So use whichever you prefer. And strings can also contain letters, numbers, symbols, and spaces, right? So I have some examples of strings here, and I actually will have a code file open at the same time that we go through this. I've created a lecture6.py file, and inside of here, we can look at some of these examples, right? So we can create a variable named message, and we can assign it to the value of hello world, okay? And then we may also create a variable named name, and we can assign it the value Noah, okay? And we can go ahead and save our file. And why don't we print both of these variables? So we can just say print and then pass in message, and it'll print our message. And then we can do the same thing here with name, and it'll print both of those out. So I'm going to go ahead and run this file, and you'll see it's printed hello world and Noah. And do note also that I've used both double quotes in this example and single quotes, just showcasing that you can use whichever you prefer. So use whatever is easiest. Also, strings are sequences, right? So strings behave like lists of characters. And I don't remember if we've gone into lists all that much yet, but you'll understand a bit how lists work more later on if we haven't covered it yet. But strings behave like lists of characters. So each character has an index, and indexing starts at 0. And this is very important. So here we have an example. I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called word, and I'm going to assign it the value Python. Okay. And then what we can do here is we can call the print function, and we can print the word, and then we could print the word at index 0. And we could also print the word here, and we may print it at index 3, okay? So the way that you specify the index is you will open and close these square brackets, as you can see here, and then you'll put the index inside of the square brackets. And this works for lists and for strings as well, because strings are, they are considered lists, right? They behave like lists. They're a list of characters. So when we are referencing word at index 0 here, that means we are starting at index 0 of our string. So index 0 would be the P in Python, okay? And remember, that's because indexing starts at 0. So if we wanted to access word at 3, then we would go 0, 1, 2, 3, and H would be at index 3. So why don't we go ahead and run the file, and you'll see that we both display P and H from our word variable. And that is because we are accessing the 0 and 3rd index, okay? And then we also, in addition, this is called positive indexing, right? Where we use positive numbers. We can also use negative indexing, okay? So positive is from left of the string to right of the string, and negative is from the right of the string to the left of the string, okay? And obviously you do need to use the minus symbol or negative symbol to specify that it's negative. And negative indexing can be extremely useful for accessing the last character of a string. So again, with our example word equals Python here, let's try some negative indexing. So let's say we wanted to access the last character of our string. Well, inside of our square brackets, we could put -1, and that would actually reference the end of our string right here. So it would reference n. Now, when we're using negative indexing, remember that -1 is the very last character in our string, okay? And that's obviously because you can't have -0, right? So if 0 is the start of the word, it can't also be the end of the word. So -1 would print out n because we start from the very end when we do -1. And then let's also print out word at the index -2, okay? And again, if n is -1, then O would be -2, okay? So why don't we go ahead and run the file, and you can see that we are printing out n here, and we are printing out O. I'm going to pull this up so you can see it a little bit better. There you go. All right. We can also print the length of a string or get the length of a string, right? So we can use len and then open and close parentheses to count characters. And that's the len method, okay? And this does include spaces and punctuation, okay? So here, what we can do is we can print, and then we'll open and close parentheses. And why don't we print the length of word, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and save the file and run this. And you can see here, if I drag this up again, you can see it's printing out 6 because our word is 6 characters long. If we add in some spaces into our word and then save our file and run it again, then you'll see that it is printing out 10 this time, okay? And you'll see that our indexing here, it's actually printing out a little bit differently, and that's because we've added spaces at the beginning and the end, right? So we're printing out 3 different spaces here in -2, -1, and 0, because we've added spaces to our word. So just keep that in mind, that white space does matter inside of our strings, and you may not get expected results if there's white space inside of your string that you weren't accounting for. And there is a method that we can use with strings to go ahead and get rid of unnecessary white space at the beginning and end of a string. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit here. But for now, this is how we can use the len function. So we can also loop through a string. I believe we talked about this a little bit. Maybe it was last week when we were, I think we were discussing loops last week. But strings can be used in for loops, and it's actually very common for validation, counting characters in a string, and also searching through a string. So how do we do that? I'm actually going to delete this so we don't clutter up our terminal here. And I'm going to say for char in Python. Okay. And then we put a colon at the end, and then tabbed in, we're just going to print char. Okay. And what we're doing here is we are creating we're saying for, then we're creating a variable named char, and we're saying in this string Python, and then it's just going to print each character. Okay. So it's going to loop through every single character in this string, and it's going to print each individual character. Now, the reason that we can loop through a string like this is, again, because strings behave like lists, okay? So that's all you need to know about that for now. Again, in future chapters, we're going to be going into a little bit more depth on lists, and then I think you'll understand a bit better why we're able to do this. But if we go ahead and run our file here, you can see that we are indeed, if I can grab the console here, terminal, and drag it up, you can see that we are looping through each character and printing it to the console. Awesome. So that is working exactly how we thought. Now we can also count characters, okay? So if I go ahead and delete this for now, we could have a variable named a word, and let's put banana inside of our word. And then let's also have a count variable, and we are going to initialize it to 0, okay? And then we'll say for letter, in Word. And again, remember that letter is just the name of a variable that we're creating, right? It's not any special keyword, okay, like in or for. It's just the name of a variable we're creating. So we're looping through each letter in Word, and we can do that because Word is a string. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, as you can see on the slides there, we're going to check if the letter is A, okay? And then if the letter is A, then we'll increase our count variable. And by doing so, we can actually count how many A's are in the word. So if we say if letter is equal to A, then what we're going to do is we're going to say count plus equals 1, okay? And again, we're just adding 1 to our count variable, which is started at 0. And then once this for loop is done running, what we can do is we can print, and let's go ahead and expand whatever in there. There are, and then we are going to add our count variable here. And we do need to cast this to a string here. Okay. And, or I'm sorry, we don't need to do this, I don't think. Blank. So there are, and then we stick in our count variable, right? So that's going to say how many A's there are in a word. So there are, in our case, it'll say 3. And then we're going to do another string here. We're going to concatenate another string on the end, and it is going to say A's in our word. Okay. So let's save that, and we can go ahead and run this. And oh, let's see here. We are getting an error. Okay, so it says we can only concatenate strings and not int. Okay. Now we're going to cover this in a little bit in these slides here again, but this means that basically when we're working with the plus symbol here, this plus operator, and we're working with strings, this becomes it's not addition, it's concatenation. Okay. So it only works with strings. And as you can see, if I hover over our count variable, it is an int. So what we need to do is what I was starting to do before is we need to type str, and then we need to open and close parentheses around our count variable. And what this is going to do is it's going to change the type of our count variable to a string. Okay. So now that I've saved the file, if I go ahead and run it again, you'll see that it doesn't have any issues, and it prints there are 3 A's in our word. Awesome. That's exactly what we want to happen. So this is an example of how you can count characters inside of a string. Okay. Another thing we can do is we can actually slice strings, right? This is called string slicing, and we can extract a part of a string. So the syntax of it is you have the string, and then you'll open and close square brackets, and then you'll specify a start colon end. Okay. And you don't have to specify a start and an end, but you can. And note that the end index is not included. Okay. So let's look at a few examples of this. I'm going to remove this for now. We're going to create a variable called word, and we are going to assign it the value Python. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of print functions, okay? The first, we're going to print word, and we want to start at index 0, and we want to end at index 2. Now, remember, the end is not included, so it's actually just going to print 0 to 1, okay? Let's do another one where we don't include the start index. So let's say word, or we'll include the start index in this one and no ending. So we could say 2, starting at 2, and then a colon. And what this does is it starts printing at index 2, and it goes until the very end of the string. Okay. And then a third example here, if we do word, and then we start with a colon and then put 4, what this is going to do is it's going to start at the beginning of the string by default, and it is going to go up until index 3, right? Because the 4 is not inclusive. So if we go ahead and run our file here, we pull this up, you can see that this first print function is going to print py, right? So we're getting the word at index 0 and 1. Our second is getting the thon, right? We're starting at index 2 here. So 0, 1, oops, didn't mean to switch that around. So the third index here, right? Or excuse me, the second index here is t, and then it prints everything onwards because we don't have an ending specified. And then for our last example, where we start at the beginning and end at index 4, it prints p, which is index 0, y is index 1, t is index 2, and h is index 3. And that's why it ends at h, because the 4 is not included. So the o does not get printed at index 4. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. And that is how we actually slice strings. All right. Another thing to note, strings are immutable. So what immutable means is that it cannot be changed, right? So our strings cannot actually be changed. You have to create a new string, okay? So it would be invalid if I use this example here. We'll leave word is equal to Python, but we might try to say word at index 0 is equal to p, and this is actually going to cause an error. So if I run this, you'll see that it's going to cause an error here. It says string object does not support item assignment, right? So our strings cannot be changed. So what happens if we wanted to change what was at index 0 in our word, okay? So let's say our word was Python instead. No, it's not a real word, but just bear with me. Maybe it is. I'm not aware if it is, but so what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called new word, and we're going to set it equal to, and first we will do our letter P here because we're trying to correct our word to say Python, and then we can concatenate our word variable starting at index 1 and going to the end. This is one way that we could do this. And if we run the file now, you'll see it doesn't actually print anything because we need to actually include print statements. So if we do a print here, you'll see we can print new word here, and we should also print word as well while we're at it, and we'll print word above new word. So when we run this, first we should see our word, and then we should see our new word. Okay, so why don't we run this file? And you'll see that word is still Python, but we have our new word variable now, and it says Python like it should. Okay. So that is how we can change strings. And really the way you change them is just by creating a new string. And I've been throwing around this word concatenation. This basically combining strings using the plus operator, right? This is called concatenation. I would memorize this word because it's a term that's used often, especially when working with strings and combining them. So what we could do here is we could have a variable called first equal to hello. And then we could have a variable named second, and we could assign it the value world. Okay. And then what we could do is we could have a variable called message, and we could assign it the value first. And then we could concatenate. We would concatenate an empty space first because we want a space between our words. And then we could concatenate our second variable here. And then if we went ahead and actually printed message here, you would see that our strings have been concatenated together. So if I run the file and pull this up, you can see that it says hello world all on one line, and there's a space between hello and world because we added this space right here. Okay. And as I was touching on earlier, when working with concatenation, numbers need to be converted to a string, right? So if you remember, if I add in a variable called age and I set it equal to 20, let's just double check. Okay. And then we tried to say print, and then we could say age, and then try to concatenate age onto the end of this. It might actually be fine because we haven't done anything. Let's say age is equal to 15. plus 5 instead to make sure that age is an int. And hopefully it should give us an error. Yep. So it gives us an error and it says, hey, you can't do that. You can only concatenate strings to strings, right? So in order to do something like this, we would need to say, again, str and put parentheses around our variable that we're changing to a string, okay? So that is how we do concatenation. Now we can look at the in operator, right? So we've talked about this in before. We use it in for loops, right? But we can use it in print statements as well. So in can be used to check if a substring exists, right? So it can be useful for validation, for searching, and for filtering input. So why don't I go ahead and create our word variable again and assign it the value banana. Okay. And then what we can do is we can have our first print. We're going to print A in Word. Okay. And both of these are actually going to return a Boolean. So the second one is print Z in Word. And both of these will return a Boolean value. So basically what this is doing is it's seeing if A is in our word variable, which it is. So it'll return true. The second print is checking if the character Z is in our word. It's not, so it'll return false. So if I go ahead and pull this up here, you can see that we are getting Boolean values returned here, okay? So hopefully by this little example, you can see how this can be very useful when validating, searching, and also filtering input. Strings also have multiple built-in methods. And these methods, again, do not modify the original string. They create a new string, okay? So some common methods, lower, right? Lower returns a new string with all lowercase letters. Upper returns a new string with all uppercase letters. There's the strip method, which I referenced before. What strip does is it removes a white space from the beginning and the end of a string. So it's good to use this method when you're getting input from users to just call the strip method on their input just to ensure that there's no unneeded white space at the beginning or end of the string. There's also the find method, which we'll look at in a second. This searches for the position of one string within another. And then there's also starts with, and starts with returns a Boolean value depending on what's passed in. Okay, so let's look at searching with methods. And this is using that find method I was talking about. So if we have our word equals banana here, and again, I should talk about this first. So what find returns is if it finds the what we pass in, right? It'll return the index if it's found. And if it's not found, it'll return -1. So let's see this in our file over here. We'll use our word equals banana still. And what we're going to do is we're going to print, and then we're going to call word.find. And in our first example, let's look for NA in our word, okay? And then in our second example, we're going to keep it simple, call word.find, and we are just going to look for Z. And what we should see here is that in our first print statement, if we pull this up, you'll see that it is telling us it found NA at index 2, right? So B is at 0, A is at 1, N is at 2, and that's where NA is found, right, in our word. So it's at index 2. And then in our second print, you see we get -1, and that's because Z is nowhere to be found in our word. So it just returns a -1. And that's how we use find with our strings. Now, again, if we wanted to, we could say word.upper if we wanted to use upper. We could also say word.lower, but obviously word.lower is not going to do anything in our case. Why don't we change this to a capital B, and then we can see how both of these work. So if I go ahead and run this, you'll see that in our terminal, we're printing all uppercase banana and all lowercase banana. So that's how we can use upper and lower. Oh, and another method that we can use is replace, right? So we can replace text using the replace method. And it is important to note that this is not modifying the original string, right? The original string stays unchanged. It is returning a new string, okay? So why don't we create a variable named text and set it equal to hello world, okay? And then underneath that, let's create a variable called new text. And we are going to assign it the value of text.replace. So we're calling the replace method on our text variable. And what we want to do is we want to replace the word world, and then we'll put a comma to separate our text to replace and the text we're replacing it with. And let's replace it with Python. Okay. So it should say hello Python now. And then what we're going to do is we are going to print our new text. Okay. So if I go ahead and run this and pull up the terminal here, you can see it says hello Python. And just to show that we're not modifying any of the original text, let's also say print text here. So that way we can see both of them side by side. And you can see it says hello world and then hello Python for our new text. Okay. So that's how we can replace text using the replace method. We can also parse strings. So what this does is it breaks strings into parts using the split method. Okay, and the result will be a list. So let's say we have a variable named data, and we set it equal to apple, comma, banana, comma, orange. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called items, and we are going to set it equal to data.split. And then if I spell split correctly here, and then inside of the parentheses, we want to specify where we're splitting the string. Okay. So what we're going to do is open quotes, and we are going to split every time there is a comma. Okay. And then what we'll do here is we are going to print items. Okay. So let's run this file. And if I pull this up here, you'll see that it returns a list. You can tell by these square brackets. And in the list is apple, banana, and orange, each their own elements. Okay. And that is how we can parse strings, and we can actually take data in to our program, and we can separate that data from a string into a list. Okay. We can also compare strings. I believe we've gone over this before. Just a note on comparing strings, right? Comparisons are case sensitive. So you should normalize before comparing with lower or upper, right? So here in this example, apple all lowercase is not the same as apple with an uppercase A. That would return false. But if we have, apple all lowercase and apple all lowercase, it'll return true. Okay. So this can be a big point where beginners can slip up a lot or run into issues, not remembering that you need to watch your case as comparisons are case sensitive. And here I just have some common issues when debugging strings. So off by one indexing errors, right? Because indexing starts at 0. It can be a little tricky to learn when you're first beginning, and it's very easy to forget. Also, forgetting strings are immutable. That's a big one. Mixing strings and numbers, and also case sensitivity, like we just talked about. Okay. And why do strings matter? Why is it important to have a chapter dedicated to strings and going over strings? Strings are used practically everywhere, right? Their user input is strings. We get strings from files, from web data, for validation, for game text, for logs and messages. Strings are very fundamental to programming. So it's important to understand them and to understand what we can do with strings. So some of the things we covered in this lecture, we covered strings are sequences, right? Which makes them similar to lists, which we'll cover in a later chapter. We talked about indexing and slicing strings. We talked about looping through strings. We talked about immutability. Some some common string methods that you can use, and also parsing and searching text. So that is all for this lecture on chapter 6 here. Make sure to read the text if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next video.